Across our region, Across our region, many countries are making major decisions with regard to energy security, sustainability, and importantly, the just energy transition. Today, we wanted to create an educational space for young people to understand some of the issues that we're facing and hear directly from people working in these fields. We are privileged to be joined by these three individuals, and we hope that this isn't a stuffy process. It's a open forum for us to have discussions. Um, so we'll start off by having an icebreaker, but then we'll move into asking each panelist some questions. And at the end, we will have a Q&A for you to ask anything that you want at the end. So first, I will invite my technical assistants to drop the Mentimeter link in the chat so we can get to know each other a little better before, we move into the questions. Um, so give me 1 second. Let's get that link on. There should be a QR code. Okay, link. There's a link in the chat. So let's see if there's anyone joining us today from outside of Trinidad and Tobago. So if you click the Menti link, there's some questions for you to respond to. So we have Trinidad and Tobago, as expected. Some more Trinidad and Tobago.
I don't see the link. Sorry,
Do you not see the link?
not in the chat now. Ah, it's
Not
there
in the
now.
chat?
It's here now. Just came up.
Okay, great. So the responses are loading. The Commonwealth of Dominica. More Commonwealth of Dominica. And I will be a little biased here. I think Dominica is my second home. I think it's my favorite island outside of Trinidad and Tobago. So I'm very happy to see some Dominicans in the chat. Okay, so it seems to be that we're dominated by Trinidad and Tobago and Dominica today, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Alrighty, so let's move on. Um, there's one other question here. So we want to know when you hear the term energy security, what comes to mind? So feel free to drop your comments. Let's get the conversation rolling. It doesn't have to be right, but we just want to know what do you think when you hear the term energy security? Don't be shy, drop your answers. So we have some answers coming up. Resilience, adaptation, energy conservation, renewable energy. I think these are all excellent answers. Energy efficiency. I think that is key when we talk about energy security. So we have some more renewable energy. I think we're all on the same page based on these answers. And I think this is a good way for us to segue into the session. Peace. Yeah, we need a lot of that right now in the world. So, not to keep us back any further, I am now going to introduce our first panelist, Miss Destiny Hines from Guyana. I'm going to give you a little background about Destiny before she introduces herself and we ask her a couple questions. Destiny Hines from Guyana is a HSSE young professional with 3 years experience in high hazard industrial environments, inclusive of oil and gas and solar PV operations, installation and maintenance, with specializations in environmental compliance, and she has a growing knowledge of ESG regulation. Her goal is to influence policy development and promote clean energy adaptation and ensure the sustainability efforts are inclusive, accessible, and culturally resonant with all Guyanese, from combining technical knowledge, leadership, advocacy, and community development. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Destiny.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So let's move right into the questions. So the first question for you is Guyana is experiencing rapid economic growth at the moment through
Mhm.
the energy sector. How does this balance against environmental and climate concerns that people may have about the future? If you want, I
Sure.
can repeat the question for you again.
hmm
Okay. So Guyana is currently experiencing economic growth via the energy sector. What we're asking is how does this balance against environmental and climate concerns that people may have about the future?
Well, that's a really good question, first of all. And well, for me, as we understand that the energy sector you're referring to is the recent oil boom that Ghana's had in the coming years. But this oil boom is actually to generate revenue to fund our energy transition towards renewable energy, specifically as part of the LCDS or Low Carbon Development Strategy targets, which is the 70% dependence on renewable energy by 2030. And so we have to, in lieu of transitioning into renewable energy, meet the demand of our rapidly growing population. But as a young professional in the energy and environmental industry, I've personally observed that the efforts made to reduce the environmental impact is largely implemented by international bodies and is done through international funding. So unfortunately, where these funding mechanisms are unavailable, the lack of interest towards environmental and climate concerns are largely unpenalized and directed more to reactive-based mechanisms and the reduction of front-end costs that put strain on our current resources. That's just all to say that our current regulations and legislation does not consider environmental and climate impact as much. But all of our projects that are funded by international bodies such as the World Bank or the Inter-American Development Bank do meet international standards due to the fact that they are requiring international funding.
Thank you so much for that answer. And what I, really appreciate about that is that you noted that you're experiencing this current oil boom, but you're also focused as a country on that energy transition. And I think that is so important. So even though you're going through a boom, you haven't forgotten about the energy transition, and that is your focus. And also noting that Guyana has one of the largest carbon basins in the world, that which kind of offsets a lot of that oil boom, so to speak. So I
Yeah.
want to ask you a second question now.
Mm.
And I believe you touched on some of this already in the first part of your answer. So, in countries where energy decisions are often driven by governments and large corporations, how can young people make their voices heard and meaningfully influence a national energy conversation? So, I'll ask it one more time.
Mhm.
So, in countries like Guyana, where energy decisions are often driven by governments and large corporations, how can young people make their voices heard and have a meaningful influence on national and international energy conversations?
Well, I would say get yourself in the room. There's no way that you can influence anything if you're not in the spaces that you are desperate, I would say, or interested to be a part of. And so, aside from volunteer work, just being an active participant in the conversation, being visibly seen in those spaces, interacting with like-minded professionals and youth, and even mentors that have been in the fields that you want to be in, and also utilizing social media as a medium to get the word out there, I think is the best way to challenge the direction that we are going in as a country and to get your voice heard. Another way I think we can really gauge as youth is also participating as active stakeholders in the community development projects that are happening across the country.
Thank you so much for that. I think sometimes as young people, we tend to feel like our voices are not heard. And I do think that we can be heard, but sometimes it's you have to position yourself. You have to kind of put up that fight. So, like, I'm here. I am the future. Um, Hear me out. And I know you
Yes.
yourself, you're an active member of CYEN TT. And I think CYEN also provides a really great foundation to getting involved in a lot of these areas. So thank you so much for that contribution. And now I will move on to the second panelist, and I will ask the audience to save your questions for Destiny. We're not done with Destiny. Save your questions, and we'll be back, and you can ask her questions about some of her answers. So thank you so much, Destiny.
Thank you so much.
So I will move on very quickly to our second speaker, Mr. Dalton Elwa. He is from the Commonwealth of Dominica. Mr. Elwa comes with a lot of experience, so allow me to introduce it. It's quite long, as I said, he has a lot of experience. Um, so Mr. Elwa is a safeguards lead at the Dominica Geothermal Development Company Limited. He has over 15 years of experience in geothermal energy, having been involved in Dominica's geothermal journey since 2009. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering, a Master of Energy in Geotherm and specializing in geothermal energy. And he also is a specialized, he's also had specialized training in National Geothermal Academy at the University of Nevada, Reno. Today, he leads environmental and social safeguards and community engagement for Dominica's geothermal project and has played a key role in the development of the country's 10 megawatts geothermal power plant. Please welcome Mr. Dalton Elwa. Mr. Elwa, I don't know if you also want to just briefly introduce yourself before I move into the questions
I think
or
you were
say
pretty
hi
much
to the
on point.
audience.
Huh? It's good. It's good. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here.
Okay, great. So, Mr. Elwa, I am going to ask you two questions. The first of which is Dominica is a leader in geothermal energy in the Caribbean. A lot of countries are pursuing wind and solar energy, for example, among the various sources of renewable energy. Can you tell us why Dominica chose to invest in geothermal energy in particular?
Yes. Good afternoon again, everyone. Yeah, sure. In terms of the Dominica context, geothermal energy isn't a choice that a country can make or every country can make. I think geothermal energy is a resource that has to be available in your country. It's like oil and gas in Guyana, as we just heard. So one of the key things here is to recall that geothermal is very abundant in Dominica. But even in project development and product development, as geothermal would be, you have to prove the resource. And so The first thing about geothermal is it's not cheap and it's not quick. And so, like you described in the background, we started even in 1974. The Geothermal Resource Act was passed in Dominica. You think that's over 50 years ago. So the knowledge that Dominica's hot springs and boiling lake, the second largest boiling lake in the world, was an indication of a geothermal resource, was has always been there. And so in 2016, sorry, the Geothermal Resource Development Act was passed, superseded the previous one. And so there's legislation to back up the 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 financial and commercial development of geothermal. Um, the choice or the decision to pursue geothermal stems from a few things. I covered the availability of the resource, um, but also availability, but also accessibility. And so geothermal in Dominica is, although expensive, relatively speaking, it's there, and we can get to it. I will try to qualify my statement about cost because it's inherently expensive. Drilling is expensive, exploration is expensive, but the biggest selling point for geothermal is the availability of the energy. Geothermal is good baseload, and compared to the other ones that you mentioned, solar, wind, these are intermittent sources. We are now at a peak demand of 20 megawatts. That's very small, relatively speaking, and that's Dominica as a country. Peak demand. And a 10 megawatt geothermal plant would supply a steady baseload of 50% of our peak. And many times load would sometimes drop to about 12 to 13 megawatts. So if you can have a reliable energy source that would supply your energy for, more than half your energy year round, that's 95% availability of geothermal, then it's almost a no-brainer to pursue it, given that it's available or accessible. And so while we did invest millions of dollars, I think over 100 million so far in geothermal, and that includes infrastructure and the project itself, it's almost a no-brainer to develop something that will be usable and available for the next few generations if properly managed. I want to also add the fact that we also invested in battery energy storage. That's on the existing network, and that network is now being optimized to integrate geothermal, battery energy. There's also hydro in Dominica. So the 2030 goal for Dominica is to be 100% renewable by 2030. Geothermal and hydro will allow us to observe that goal. Now, I want to be clear that this does not exclude solar and wind. It just means that geothermal would be a bigger percentage. Um, Also, I mentioned the 20 megawatt peak demand. Um, the resource that we have is almost capable of, well, not almost, but is thought to be capable of delivering probably double that, meaning that we would have excess. And so a geothermal energy investment is very attractive in the Dominica context. For background, we had explored exploitation of that energy to neighboring countries. So this is basically the justification for pursuing geothermal in lieu of, oh, well, sorry, not in lieu, but as a priority over the sources like solar and wind.
Okay, thank you so
Yeah.
much for that. Very informative. I think in media, we hear a lot about solar and wind. And, in the Caribbean, we have geothermal being developed right here in our region. And it tends to be, people tend not to know too much about it. So I think this was very informative. Um, you know, I'm very happy to hear the goals that Dominica has about, having 100% renewable energy by 2030. I think that will definitely make Dominica more of a paradise. It already is a paradise. Very lovely to hear that this is taking place in the region. I have one more question for you. You've definitely touched on some of these topics well, some of these issues already, but I'll still go ahead and ask you the question if you have anything to add. So, what impact do you expect geothermal energy to have on Dominica's energy security, electricity costs, and broader sustainable development goals?
Mhm.
Do you want
That's
me
an
to ask
excellent
one more
question.
time?
No, that's fine. That's fine. That's
Okay,
an
great.
excellent question because the pursuit of geothermal, I mentioned the cost in my previous response. That was one of the pushbacks from the general public and even, in people in leadership positions at times because it is not cheap to pursue geothermal. But the cost benefit analysis in terms of long-term benefits for Dominica and just, I guess, not just Dominica itself and the people, but the international uh, reputation of Dominica as a green country would benefit as well from that same 2030 goal, plus geothermal itself being that key driver of that pursuit. But the biggest selling point, like I was saying, was the cost of power. You can attract it, yes, it will look good to tourists and so on. You can't tell someone you can't sell that to a Dominican who's in it all the time. You can't sell lush green forests and waterfalls to a Dominican when you're doing a project. They will ask you, what am I going to pay? And so that was the major selling point. So inherently, we had to pursue a project that satisfied that condition. That's number one. And so the expectation and plan, and we are on have achieved the goal of reducing the cost of energy in Dominica. The amount I cannot tell you off my head, of course, because we're just commissioning the plant right now as we speak. But the reliance on the transition from diesel, because we are now at a 25 to 75% of hydro to diesel. Hydro will remain, and that 75% diesel generation will be displaced by geothermal, mostly. And so the cost of fuel surcharge, which is part of our tariffs, will be greatly reduced. Geothermal will also bring cost stability. The Iran war has raised fuel prices, fuel surcharge has increased. And even with the commissioning phase of geothermal, that's a real world example. Domlec, which is the power company of Dominica that distributes the energy, has shown that even with the increase of fuel costs, geothermal energy integrated into the grid right now has kept prices low. It was bad timing because you have seen a bigger decrease had there not been that increase from that war. But this is exactly what I mean: is that the the diesel versus geothermal was a no-brainer, and so we do expect a reduction of costs. Stability is another one because of that same fluctuation in international prices based on the feelings of a mad dictator or a crazy president. And so we as the smaller countries, we are more vulnerable to these external impacts. Um, so one, we will stabilize costs. Two, we will have the security because if you look at it, I mentioned that Dominica's geothermal will give about 50% of the peak, but even higher in terms of an average. With hydro and diesel, if hydro and geothermal, if no more diesel comes to Dominica for the rest, forget transport, that's another sector. But just for power generation, we would be able to generate Dominica at a pretty significant percentage consistently, just with geothermal and hydro as we speak. And so security and stability plus reduction in costs is already being realized in Dominica as we speak.
Thank you. That was extremely informative. And, what I gather from what you're saying is that for Dominica, energy security looks like self-sufficiency. Not having to rely on energy sources that are, very volatile,
Volatile.
depends on what's taking place in the rest of the world. And I think that is, such a wonderful thing for a small island developing state like Dominica to reach that peak in terms of their energy security. So I really look forward to, 2030, um, to see what Dominica will continue to develop as and to reach that peak of 100% renewable energy. So thank you so much for that. Um,
Thank you.
Again, members of the audience, write down your questions. We're not done with Mr. Elwell. We're going to come back and ask him questions at the end. I'm going to move on to our third panelist now, Mr. Colin Mendoza, um, who's going to talk to us a bit about uh, just transition. I'm going to give you a brief introduction. So, Mr. Colin Mendoza, he works with climate analytics as a climate with the climate diplomacy team as the climate policy advisor. His focus is on just transition and energy transition of SIDS, but also a focus on climate change law, policy, human rights, disaster law, and disaster risk reduction. Prior to joining climate analytics, he worked with the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies in the Dutch and English-speaking Caribbean. He has served as legal counsel for the Belize Tourism Board. He also held the post of magistrate in the judiciary of Belize. He is an attorney at law, legal consultant in Trinidad and Tobago. He's a graduate from the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill, and the recipient of a Chevening Scholarship. So welcome, Colin. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks very much for having me. Yeah.
Thank you. Um, and I will just insert here that I have worked with Colin in the past. I know he has a wealth of experience in just transition, and I'm very excited to ask him these questions. So let's move right into it. So, Colin, what is just transition and how is it relevant to Caribbean small island developing states?
All right. Thanks, Dina. So I'll just pick up right from where Destiny had left off, in terms of talking about the fact that Guyana is in an oil boom, but they are also trying to measure that oil boom with their transition priorities. And that is exactly what a just transition is that ability or the activity, sorry, to move from an area of high carbon emissions to low carbon emissions in terms of fulfilling your long-term climate strategies and goals in a fair, just, and equitable manner. That is exactly what the premise or concept of a just transition is. What we've seen internationally is that there is no set definition for just transition. Just transition is applicable to all countries, to all peoples, to different sectors and different societies. So what we need to do in this sort of approach is understand what does a just transition look like for our individual countries, small island developing states, as well as CARICOM countries, inclusive of Guyana and Belize. So I was very happy to hear that Guyana has that at their forefront. And even in listening to Dalton in terms of what the work that Dominica is doing in terms of that geothermal and renewable energy and that energy sustainability and self-reliance, that is also part and parcel of a just transition. It's ensuring that we work towards those goals. We link our transition priorities with our development priorities at all levels of governance. And it will be remiss of me not to also mention that these transition priorities must be rooted in the Paris Agreement and its long-term temperature goal of 1.5 degrees to keep the temperatures at a level below 1.5 degrees, before pre-industrial times. So it is a concept that is, I wouldn't say growing. It has grown, it has developed, but it's taken a very, I would say, fast approach, and particularly how it could look like for us because we are heavy uh, reliers of energy and we are heavy importers of energy and rely on subsidies, etc. I think how that will look for us is in the way that Destiny and Dalton explored in terms of how do we make ourselves much more sufficient or self-reliant given our own unique circumstances and contexts and our natural resources that we have within the region. How do we now implement just transition principles into our large economies, which are heavily reliant on tourism and agriculture? I think those are the questions that we have to answer. So I'll stop right there.
Thank you so much for explaining that, Colin. And something that I noted you said is that there's no set definition for just transition. But I do know that there's so many factors that we have to take into consideration in the transition, which tells me that, it's not necessarily a straightforward concept. It is complex. There are a lot of things to take into consideration. And that's a major takeaway I've gotten from that. Um, so we have one more question for you. And one second, I seem to have lost the question. Okay, so I found it. So the question is, what role does just transition play in achieving our climate goals? And how can we ensure that no one is left behind in the process?
So yeah, I think the role that the transition plays in achieving climate goals. So we know that, well, I would explain that the goals in the Paris Agreement would be one, the mitigation goal, which is the 1.5 to not to have temperatures rising above 1.5 degrees Celsius to keep our temperature or emissions there. We have goals in terms of adaptation goals, in terms of how do we adapt to climate change. And then we also have goals in terms of climate finance and how do we treat with SIDS and their abilities, or SIDS and less developed countries with their abilities to access climate finance and prevent issues of loss and damage. So we have those goals there, and the transition falls hand in hand with those goals because in order for us to really and truly achieve those goals, the transition principles needs to be rooted in the concepts of climate justice. I would say that because the just transition is about fairness, it's about equity, and as you stated in the question, it's about leaving no one behind. And that is also mentioned, that phrase, leaving no one behind, is also mentioned in the Paris Agreement, in the preamble of the Paris Agreement, that speaks to when it talks about the transition. But it spoke to the transition in a narrow focus, which spoke to the workforce. So it's evident, and we've seen, and I mean, you can tell that if we are to move from high carbon to low carbon, if we are to reduce our emissions, that means there will be persons who are currently employed in oil and gas will no longer be employed in oil and gas. There are persons who are employed in extractive industries that have high emissions that will no longer be able to have employment or seek employment in those industries. So what do we do with those persons? How do we retrain them, reskill them, and retool them to take up these new jobs or positions in renewable energy? So all of that goes hand in hand with the Paris Agreement, with the climate goals, with ensuring that there's a fair and just transition. I think what is also very much important is that we as small island developing states needs to ensure that because as I going back to my original question, the first question in terms of there's no sort of set definition, we need to ensure that the concepts of just transition are contextualized to our realities. We need to make sure that it's not too broad or generalized statements or concepts, and that there's no one size fits all approach with respect to the transition and how that looks within our countries and within our economies. So we need whole of society approaches within our transitions. We need for governments to articulate their visions of green transition following those sort of whole of society approaches. So it is from stakeholder consultation in communities, with young persons, with vulnerable persons, with the elderly, because what we don't want happening is the risk of an unjust transition. So let's give the just normal, tangible example in terms of if we are now to remove off of this sort of fuel, heavy fuel dependency for energy and for electricity, and we're now moving to renewables and we're moving to solar, for example. We need to ensure that countries or persons in communities have the adequate support system, which is proper housing, proper roofs to maintain these solar panels. Because what you would not want is in the event that countries, governments go and pass a law that, okay, now everyone has to have solar panels on their rooftops or have solar panel fees or access to solar panels. How is that transition now fair and just? If the persons in the communities they don't have the infrastructure to aid and facilitate in that transition, that is not a just transition. That is not fair. That is not equitable, and that definitely doesn't bring someone forward. It rather carries them back. And that also now goes to the climate finance goals in respect to when we're doing these transition activities, we have to ensure that it is properly financed, that communities are able to access the climate finance needed to enact or I guess, yeah, engage in this transition. So I think your question is very much on point, and I am very happy to have this discussion, especially pulling off and listening to the other two speakers who came before me, to really show that it's very much circular in terms of you have your activities planned for your country, but you must ensure that these activities are done in a particular manner that embeds the principles of climate justice within it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Colin. There was something you said that stood out to me. You used the word equitable. And in order for it to be just, it needs to be equitable. And something I didn't even contemplate. I'm familiar with just transition, but even the elderly, it's that far reaching. When you want people to use solar panels and so on, but can they afford it? Um, it really is a whole of society approach when it comes to that just transition, and something that we really need to be mindful of. So thank you so much for that contribution. Um, we've come to the end of, the major questions that we have for our panelists, but there are still more questions to be asked. I know members of the audience may have some questions. You can drop your questions in the messages, or I believe there will be a link slash QR code that will be sent in the chat for you to ask questions. But in order to, start off the question and answer segment, I'm going to ask a general question to the panelists. So I will get started on that. So this question would be more so, I think, for Dalton and Destiny. My question is, what would you say is the biggest barrier to energy security in your specific country, or if you would like to expand it to the Caribbean? So my question is, what do you think is the biggest barrier or hurdle to energy security in your specific country, that is Guyana, Dominica, or if you would like to answer it in a wider Caribbean context? Either one of you can jump in and answer at this point.
Okay.
Dalton. Okay, so we start with Dalton. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Just thinking about the security aspect of energy, which I explained, we're trying to do geothermal to mitigate that risk. I still think costing and development of these projects is a huge barrier. So it's one of the key things that we faced. We had a failed procurement for geothermal, and also some partners that initially proposed or committed to development of geothermal. We had them pull out of it wasn't an agreement yet, but at least the development. And so funding is the biggest one, money. And I would be responsible if I mentioned that, if I didn't mention that I think for me, the second one would be environmental considerations, environmental and social risks that these projects bring along. And they can be easily derailed by by not being prepared for these. So specific to Dominic, I think, yes, we can say that we can reduce the security, we can improve our energy security by development of the geothermal project, but projects themselves, I think financing is, and of course, like local expertise, and just the acceptance from a local level of these new developments. So just a few here, but I would put financing at the top, and I would put environmental, social second, and of course, social acceptance and other risks would also be in there as well.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. Thank you. And I think, for small island developing states, finance is always kind of at the top of, you know, that barrier it always kind of leads back to finance for us, small island developing states. We don't always have the capital for all the initiatives that, we want to pursue. But it appears to me that Dominica has managed to jump over a lot of those hurdles to get where they are right now. I'm very happy to see that. Um, Destiny, I invite you to jump in now and maybe give your perspective um, in terms of Guyana or the wider Caribbean as you might see it.
Yes. Adding especially to what Dalton said, funding is a very big hurdle that we face also in Guyana. Leaning back to what I had mentioned previously, the international funding is what leads the standard for a lot of projects that happen in Guyana, and I'm sure it might be similar for other countries. But where this funding is not as highly measured, a lot of the decision making leads more to cutting costs, so cutting corners. Another one that I would consider a major hurdle is the community. What's the word? Stakeholder engagement, having active participants from stakeholders that are being actively affected by the changes that are happening in their community. A lot of the projects that are happening without international funding and thus without the lean and greater emphasis on importance to making considerations around what happens in people's communities. They don't contact people directly. They don't have active engagements to let people know what is happening around them. And so it is not greatly accepted by these communities. And so a lot of the languages that we use, especially when it comes to the culture, between businesses and locals, or even between organizations to the businesses that then transfer this information and impact to locals, needs to be revised. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for adding to that, Destiny. So I have a similar question now for Colin, but it's slightly different. So my question is, what is the biggest barrier you would say to just transition in the Caribbean region?
Yes. Um, that question, I'm not sure might get me in some trouble, but I think this is a safe space. I think one of the biggest barriers, for sure, our um, is political will within our countries, within our islands. I think we all see and talk the talk of just transition and the renewable energy and et cetera, all these niceties or nice phrases that we hear. But I think when it comes to actually putting it into action in terms of, let's just give the first example in terms of within the UN climate change process, each country has to submit an NDC, nationally determined contribution, which is basically their plan as to how they will achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. And within that plan, there should be some aspects of how you also intend to achieve these goals in a fair and just manner, the just transition aspects or elements. And even if it's not included in that plan, some countries may opt to have a just transition sort of framework or a roadmap, an energy transition. So you mightn't see the term just transition, it might more be interchangeably used as energy transition. So you would see some countries may have an energy transition roadmap. And whilst all these things are well and good, they engage consultants to prepare these roadmaps, etc. I think where we fall short is the actual implementation and then further execution of these plans or these roadmaps. And then it goes back into funding. So I would say political will and buy-in is maybe one of the top barriers to a just transition, but funding is also equally as important because most governments, especially Caribbean governments, would indicate that they don't have the budget to really and truly fund a transition. Which is why you have simultaneous activities of oil and gas exploration happening whilst we also trying to move into a renewable energy because you have to meet some sort of your budget or your expenses by a certain in a certain manner. So I think it is really and truly within our space a delicate balance that we need to have with respect to how we fund a transition, but then what we do in order to receive those fundings. But as you indicated, as well as the other two speakers before spoke about climate finance and financing being one of the major barriers or hindrances, it's equally applicable to this situation as well.
Thank you, Colin. So once again, we're seeing finance being at the top of, a lot of issues facing energy security in the Caribbean and that energy transition. Um, it's always gonna go back to that for SIDS. And, I'm happy you kind of touch on the political will as well. A bit controversial at times anytime you bring up the word politics or political or anything of that sort. But I mean, I do think it is very seriously, it is a factor. Um, so let's move on to some questions that are in the chat. Now, there are some questions that are a bit long-winded, so I may invite the people in the audience, if you're so inclined, to ask the questions out loud. As I mentioned before, I don't want this to be like a stuffy interaction. Feel free to put on your mic and ask the questions, but I see there's one that's a bit shorter, so I'll start with that one. Um, I believe it's a general question, so anyone can jump in. So it says, and it's from CYENTT. Do you all think that regional collaboration might be a useful way for us to strengthen our energy security as individual countries? So I'll ask it one more time. Do you think that regional collaboration might be a useful way for us to strengthen our energy security as individual countries? Any of the panelists can feel free to jump in and share their thoughts on that regional collaboration with regard to
I could take that question, Dina.
sure.
And I think the reason why I'll take that question is because we do have a we call it CSIMS. I can't remember exactly what it stands for, but it talks about an energy roadmap that was created by CARICOM. So like C-SERMS.
Yeah.
And that is what is supposed to be our regional roadmap towards renewable energy and energy security within the region. I think we can go a step further. And to answer your question, yes, collaboration is very much important, very much useful. But it's always what we do further along, as I indicated, what we do further to these policies and roadmaps and documents that we have. Because one thing we're good at in the region is creating a document and creating a policy. I don't think that in terms of execution and implementation, that's where we fall short. And again, no fault of ours too much in terms of it's expensive to do these things. But there's also another step that we can take with respect to, because I think I saw it in a question here in terms of if you are on a grid, then your access to renewable energy. I'm not an engineer and I don't really know all the intricacies of it. So I'll leave those type of questions to Dalton and Destiny. But in terms of policy and law, I could tell you that we fully need a revamping of our systems and our policies to actually cater for renewable energy so that issues like those where we have policy or legislation that blocks or prevents persons from accessing renewable energy material or equipment because they are on a electric grid and it's controlled by the regulators, etc. I think that is where the need for harmonized policy and legislation throughout the region is something that would be beneficial. And then when you have that sort of harmonized policy or legislation, then it could trickle down into individual countries as to this is what is needed to effect or implement these renewable energy strategies for each individual country so that's not contradictory to some policies or law. So we need amendments, we need reviews of reviewing of law, we need repealing of acts, etc. So it will take some time, but it'll also take that sort of concerted effort on all our ends. So Destiny, and I'm sure others could come in.
And before they answer, let me just say thanks, Colin. And something that I noticed is, you talk about harmonized policy and legislation, and that still ties back into your previous point of political will, because that's where the legislative amendments and drafting and policy comes from. So it all just kind of all feeds into each other. Destiny or Dalton, I don't know if you have anything to chime in there. If not, I'll move on to the next question.
I don't have much to add there. Thank you.
Okay,
Dalton.
no problem. Destiny?
Just really quickly adding to what Mr. Carlin said. First of all, incredible answer. I am always really interested when it comes to policy and policy development and revamping. Another thing is definitely leading into policy, education. A lot of the people and a lot of leaders when it comes to these things are more focused on finance than they are about long-term goals and sustainability when it comes to these systems and why we need to lean more into renewable energy systems. Even here in Guyana, a lot of the language that is used around renewable energy, around our carbon sinks, is the amount of money that we make from it, and not about the real purpose of why we need to go into this direction, why we as a country, as a community, as patrons of the environment need to move towards renewing our systems that work with the environment instead of against it. So thank you so much again.
Dana, you're on mute.
Oops. Uh, Moderator's worst nightmare. But yes, thank you so much, Destiny, for contributing. Um, so I see there's a question from Miriam in the comment section. Miriam, I don't know if you feel so inclined to unmute yourself and ask the question. I think it would be a nice contribution to the session. If not, I can try and, summarize and ask it, but feel free to unmute yourself and ask if you're so inclined. Fingers crossed, Miriam. Sorry, it's Marianne. Sorry. I'm a bit blind. Marianne, are you inclined to unmute yourself? You can message in the chat. Or there's another question from Matthias Noel.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. Do you mind asking your question?
Yeah, that's no problem.
Okay.
My question was more around how we can use renewables in TNC. So it was it was a question targeted to Destiny, but it was given that TNTech, our electricity commission in TNT, that they basically have this law that so you're not able to use, you're not able to domestically use renewable energy from renewable sources if if you are connected to the national grid. How do we as youths go about navigating an energy dilemma like this? And I also had another question on the storage of renewable energy to Destiny as well, where because I remember you mentioned that Guyana is moving more towards using renewable energy sources. So I wanted to know that given our economic and geographic risks, which are like that we are smaller than developing states, so we don't have the funds that a lot of the countries in the global north would have, and we also are very vulnerable to certain geographical risks such as hurricanes and earthquakes. How do we navigate storing issues like how do we navigate storing energy like this?
That was a great question. Thank you so much again, Matthias. Um, yes, so I would have stated in the chat about, because I didn't think it would be said out loud, that the way Guyana has dealt with the renewable energy transition specifically, and especially in alignment with, as you know, Georgetown being across the coast and most dependent on our grid systems to get electricity directly to our grid. Um, our electricity systems right now have been slowly transitioning from fossil fuel dependence into renewable energy. We have actually developed about 8 solar farms. Five are now live that are connected directly to our Demerara Berbice interconnect system. However, we do also have a policy that essentially states that we cannot go as domestic citizens, as domestic users of electricity off grid to utilize off grid systems. But we do have what you call is a grid tied system. It was actually also an initiative from the Guyana Energy Agency in which we encourage users to set up solar PV systems on their rooftops so that they can offset the cost of electricity. And so when they don't have what's it called? Access to sunlight to generate electricity on their in their homes, they can then get electricity from the grid. And if they generate more electricity from the solar PV system, the extra electricity goes directly to the grid and can what's the word be sent to other homes that need it. So looking into grid tied systems as a country, I think would be a wise decision because I know that the understanding is the fact that we do need to generate income and a lot of as a country and a lot of that money from for the systems and for our economy does come from the electricity that we produce. Um, and then on your second aspect of your question, which was the storage, energy storage is much, much more expensive than energy capture. If a solar grid system, which is like your PV, solar panels or your solar arrays and your connectors and your DC and AC systems are like $1 million, your battery is gonna be like $4 million. It is incredibly, incredibly expensive. The and that is a big issue when it comes to going off grid altogether. The fact that storing that energy for a rainy day is going to cost you a whole lot. And as a country, I could understand why you would want to essentially stick to what you know and stick to what you is going to be there for you when the sun isn't out, for example, or when renewable energy systems are not as proficient in what they can achieve. So, the way Guyana would have kind of addressed that would have been through the IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, does provide funding for us to complete these more national projects. And so advocating for funding go through what I would say and honestly, this is my more amateur opinion in this specific part because this is more a policy conversation. But the funding that you can get from UNs and like international funding mechanisms are often the way the Caribbean or well Guyana at the very least would have leaned into so that they can complete these projects and move away from our fossil fuel dependence. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, you did. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Destiny.
I
That was
Thank
very
you.
comprehensive. Matthias, you had something to say?
Yeah, I was going to say that. So I have two more questions, each for the other two panelists, but I would let the others ask questions before I come back.
Okay, we can come back to you. So let me just have a quick look in the chat. Okay, so Marianne is not able to ask her question. So I will try to go through her question. And anyone can jump out and ask. Okay, so let me let Shahad ask his question in the meantime, and I'll try to summarize Marianne's question. So Shahad, I don't know if you want to jump in now and ask your question.
Hi, good
Or
afternoon,
Gary.
guys. Hope you guys could hear me loud and clear.
Okay, great. Yes.
So, thanks, Makila, for the invitation. Thanks to CYE and Trinidad and the others. I see Gary from Dominica is here. You guys had done a good job here on the geothermal plant. Question. I think to all the presenters, I should say, what would have been some of the challenges that you faced putting out the whole renewable energy and energy efficiency towards the youth or the persons that are within the whole energy sector, I should say. That's one. And for Destiny, if you can please elaborate on the energy corridor for the three Guyanas. Thanks.
Okay. I don't know which one of the panelists want to jump in to answer, and I want to be sure that they're clear on the question being asked.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Dana,
Colin, you
I'll
want to go
jump
ahead?
in quickly, to answer the first part of Shahad's question in terms of challenges with youth. So as I said, I work more in the policy legal space through the UN, so the climate meetings in terms of COP and the other meetings surrounding those activities under the Paris Agreement. What I would say particularly, I have not seen much engagement from Caribbean youth at those meetings. And I think CYEN is doing a good job in setting these sort of foundation um, seminars or webinars to sort of educate. So one, we need education, but then I think we also need visibility and engagement from young people from the region in these processes. I understand that obviously it's very expensive because these trips to these different meetings are not cheap and you'll have to source funding. But I do believe that CYN through their networks are able to find where those sort of sponsorship or funding can come from. But it would be great to see engagement. I think that's one of the barriers in terms of we are not visible in those spaces, and then therefore our voices in terms of the different thematic areas or issues being discussed and negotiated are not at the forefront in those spaces. So that's something that I think we could work on a little better within our region. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Colin. Destiny or Dalton, I don't know if you want to jump in. If not, I'll move on to another question.
Yeah,
I
just
can,
a, oh, sorry.
if
Yeah,
you
just
want,
a
you can
quick
go
point.
first. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah,
Okay, so Destiny, you go ahead, and then
ladies
Dalton.
first. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Oh, okay, no problem. So, my contribution to the first question, uh, I was actually a part of the GuySol program, which was the Guyana Utility Scale Solar Photovoltaic Program for Guyana, and that was essentially focused on constructing the solar farms that exist across the country. One of the roles that I had to play was as a supervisor to Women in Solar, which was a subgroup of this program that focused on targeting young women in the communities in which these solar farms are being built and giving them the skills that they need to not only construct these solar farms, but also to work and operate the solar farms that exist in our system. And so when it comes to energy and addressing the youth, unless you go to these communities and you target people directly and you offer them something, which is essentially a monetary value and acknowledgement, because that is truly what we need when it comes to, and that is jumping back to what was said previously, bringing awareness and education into these spaces and shedding a light on what is happening and how you can be a part of it. Young people are not that interested. And that leans a lot more into what our current form of energy, or essentially where the money is when it comes to energy in Guyana. A lot of it, a lot of the focus, a lot of the attention, and the accolade kind of goes into developing our current oil boom sector. A lot of these international companies, a lot of these international companies would have come into our country and offered really good positions that young people are very interested in, not only getting money to develop themselves, but also giving them the skills, the high quality skills that could take them anywhere. So that same offering kind of needs to be taken by the renewable energy sector so that we can be competitive, utilizing renewable energy opportunities and showcasing them to youth. And on the second question that Hussein would have said in alignment with the energy corridor, I'm not sure specifically what you want to hear about it. So can you give me a better understanding?
Just a general overview. That's all.
Oh, that's no problem. Okay, so we have two systems in Guyana. Um, that is called the Demerara-Berbice interconnected system, which is essentially across the shoreline of Guyana and going into Berbice. It is a very high power system. I think it's about 200 kilowatts or so of electricity that is generated by the different power plants across the country. I won't get into the different names of the power plants. And we also have an Essequibo isolated system that exists specifically for Essequibo region and feeds into Anna Regina Anna Regina specifically. We also have different isolated systems that are across Bartica. We have isolated systems in Laguan and Wickadam, which are the two islands. And we also have renewable energy systems that are focused on creating accessibility networks, focused more on renewable energy access in the hinterland regions within Guyana. So the interior would have more renewable energy sources or hydroelectric sources of electricity, as opposed to in town, which would have more hybrid versions of electricity utilizing both fossil fuel and solar energy. Right now, we are also completing the gas to energy plant, which promises to generate about 300 megawatts of electricity towards the Demerara-Berbice interconnected system. Yeah, that's about it.
Thank you. Dalton, I know you had something to say.
Yes, quickly on the youth engagement, we during the development of the geothermal plant, we started pre construction and even pre contract agreement. But once we were doing the procurement, we had school outreach for the entire island. And what we did is we started at the primary school level, but we did target the state college at the tertiary level, and a few high schools that had the science-based curriculum. Once we once we kind of saturated because the limited schools and so on, um, we we merged that into the construction, and we had the contractor led this, but it was in collaboration with the GDC, which where I work. We had internships at the power plant during the construction phase, and that has led to the engagement of I think 6 young people in the operations of the power plant as we speak. So, um, in terms of the requirements, though, usually you find it very gender focused. So there is a young women's initiative for STEM training, but that is through another lens. But of course, it inherently involves young women, youth in that aspect, where they provide support for any young women interested in STEM and to overcome those barriers that they face. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I'm very happy to hear that Dominica is conscious of youth involvement and mindful of youth involvement, as well as, having young women in particular involved in the process. As we know, the energy sector is dominated by men. So I'm happy to hear that was taken into consideration. So I'm going to ask Marianne's question in the chat, and then I know Gary, your hand is up, and there's someone else's hand is up. So I'm just going to ask Marianne's question, and then I'll come to the both of y'all. So Marianne's question says, given that Trinidad and Tobago's economy is heavily dependent on oil and gas, transitioning to more environmentally friendly energy sources may be costly and therefore less likely to be prioritized by the government. In this context, what steps should Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana take to advance the shift towards green energy, especially while their economies remain fragile? It's in the chat if you want to have a look at the question, but anyone can jump in and, you know, give some response. I don't know, Destiny or Colin, if you want to touch that question, considering it specifically talks to Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago.
No worries. I'll briefly take that question in terms of I think Destiny and I mean the discussion has already sort of answered the question, and Destiny could go more into detail. But from a Trinidad and Tobago perspective, um, I think that we we have been doing and I would say this on the books on the face of it, we have had steps towards that green transition. It's very slow steps, very very much crawling steps. And I say this loosely because the company, we've worked on a just transition. It was a just transition sort of framework. I can't remember the exact terminology, and it's been before cabinet for a while. And this all boils back down to what I already stated in terms of political will. As much as we can have, as much as people know what needs to be done, it always is a matter of the party of the day or the political party of the day or government of the day to take the steps that are needed, the concrete actions that are needed to move towards that green energy transition. So we've done a lot of things in terms of the reduction of taxes on electric vehicles, etc. Those are elements or little incremental steps towards a just transition. But is it enough? Is the question I'm sure you're asking yourself, and we ask ourselves all the time. So I'll stop there because again, I don't want to get too far into the political thought and that sort of thing, but it's always a concern of ours when we have to certainly, as I said, address this delicate balance of moving as quick as possible because as we are experiencing much more stronger hurricanes within these seasons and much more intense rainfall and flooding. But on how do we measure that against the action that is actually needed?
Okay, thank you so much, Colin. Because we're a little pressed for time, I'm gonna let Gary ask his question. Gary, I know your hand was up. Do you still have a question?
Hello? Yes. Yeah, I had a question, but a few of my questions got asked already. But I had a question more directed towards Mr. Dalton from Dominica, because I myself am from Dominica. Um, I understand that the transition from the geothermal onto the main grid would have started a few months ago, and we have gotten a lot of power outages and stuff like that. So I just wanted to know, from the geothermal point of view, what has been the challenges, big challenges in transitioning to the main grid? Because I know there's a lot of misconceptions. I hear people blaming Dominic, I hear people blaming geothermal. So I just wanted some clarity from the source. And I had another question in terms of you're saying it has costed millions of dollars to get this project going, and now we're at this final stage of finally getting geothermal for Dominica. But what if another huge disaster like Maria comes? Then are we going to start back to zero? And it's going to cost millions and years to get started again. So how, like, yeah, we use the word resilient a lot, but like how resilient in quote is the geothermal plant in terms of this current climate that we're in? So yeah.
Yeah, for the first question on the seemingly disastrous or very eventful commissioning process with our blackouts and so on. We are doing an not ideal, I should say, the commissioning of three different components: the geothermal plant by itself, and for the benefit of the wider audience, we also are doing a new transmission network in parallel with the geothermal plant because the existing grid wasn't able to basically uh, offload that power. So we had to do a transmission network to upgrade and to be able to accommodate the expansion of geothermal. For example, if we go to 2025 megawatt. So that transmission network is also under construction, has been commissioned as we speak in parallel with geothermal. So what you have is a not so ideal situation where the geothermal plant in the technical testing and the transmission network are finding out sort of in real time, in parallel, what the tweaks have to be. So you may find some settings have to be adjusted, maybe on a battery energy storage system on the existing grid, maybe at the power plant, and maybe on the transmission. So it's a not so ideal situation. Also, understand that you are adding 10 megawatt to a grid that is basically about double the size in terms of highest output. So it's a high risk if anything goes wrong, meaning that if you were just testing a small load, if you lose that load, then stable is good. But if you haven't finalized your geothermal best settings or best case scenario, then it's a higher risk of losing 10 megawatt in a 20 megawatt grid. And so that affects stability. But that's a transition. And so the lessons learned during each phase, and that's normal, as contrary to what people believe, that is normal for commissioning, meaning that you know settings and relays and so on as they communicate with each other. So there are technical issues, but that's the background behind it. The second point, and that I think is more relevant to the wider uh, meeting listeners here, is we are at risk for disasters, and that's true. And Hurricane Maria, we learned our lesson. Probably the entire distribution grid, well, I would say 90% was damaged by Hurricane Maria in 2017. And so the procurement of geothermal would be post 2017 and would be irresponsible not to include that as a requirement in design and construction. And so all our systems are designed for 80 meters per second winds. We have the transmission I just spoke of that was constructed, installed underground. So sustainability and resilience is built into the design. And of course, you have structures, for example, overhead lines that are built to withstand. So where you might use 2 millimeter steel, you will now use 4 millimeters. And the national planning, the planning division has upped its standards, and these has to be implemented in the construction. So all these factors are considered, and so yes, we that was factored for another event like Maria. These are black swan events, and if they come around, then you will be able to recover as a country much faster than before.
Thank you so much for that, Dalton. I know, especially for a country like Dominica, the threats of disasters, perpetual. It's always ongoing, unfortunately. So I know in that, contemplating energy security, there's always a factor that has to play. You make plans, but then as so to speak, they say God laughs. You don't know what's to come. So I'm happy to hear that there are things in place to kind of, you know, try to withstand some of those disasters that may come along the way. We are almost to the end of this session. I'm gonna try to squeeze in one more question. I'm sorry if your question wasn't asked. It has been a very great session so far. Um, I see Matthias has in the chat to Dalton. I remember you mentioned sending energy from Dominica. How feasible is it to send energy to other islands? I don't know if you can briefly touch on that before we wrap up.
Yeah, I'll be quick in the interest of time, and maybe someone can get another question. It's very feasible. 2012, there was a feasibility study done, and the plan, to be clear, was for Martinique. And so submarine cable to Martinique, feasibility study, estimated cost, of course, that's over a decade old, so it would have to be redone. I was part of a meeting about a week or two ago, led by CDB, for I think Carl mentioned a regional. I'm not sure if it's the same plan, but it's a regionally integrated grid, and that's that's the only mechanism of connection, submarine cables. So that's the plan, and it can be done in stages. If you have two islands connected to each other by submarine cable, then over time, maybe over the next few decades, then we may have a full integrated grid by submarine cable. But that has been studied and shown to be feasible and affordable.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And I want to squeeze in one more because I actually find this to be a very interesting question to call on. How beneficial is the existence of carbon credits in just transition? He is saying that he sees it as an easy exit. But I don't know if you just want to touch on that briefly.
Yeah, I'll touch on that because it's a ever-growing sort of uh, interesting point happening within the space within the negotiation. So you have the Article 6 negotiations on carbon markets, and then we also have the just transition negotiations. What I would say is that this is a more of a personal because we haven't really gotten into depth about the interlinkages of carbon credits and how does that support just transition. But from a personal and just doing my uh, own research on it, I tend to agree that if a carbon market is not properly set up, it couldn't be an easy way out for a wealthy country to sort of purchase these credits and offsets and say that they are combating climate action, when in reality they are not going to the root of the matter, which is targeting emissions, which will definitely now lead to a just transition. So to answer your question in a nutshell, I think it is something that a carbon market and carbon credits is supposed to complement the just transition and not necessarily replace it um and sort of be like a replacement for the ex or an excuse for cutting emissions or an easy exit for these major polluters. So I'll stop right there.
Okay. Thank you so much to all the panelists. I feel like this was a very thought-provoking session. I mean, I learned a lot. There are things I didn't know about, or even things that I knew about that I got to learn more about in this session. from geothermal developments in Dominica to Guyana and their recent oil boom, but maintaining that, goal towards a sustainable future and that energy transition and learning about, what needs to be done to have that energy transition, learning that from Carlon. So thank you so much to all the panelists for taking your precious Saturday afternoon for being here. And thank you to everyone in the chat for also attending and also giving some really excellent questions. Like, I'm actually kind of sad that we didn't get to go through all the questions, but I think it has been an excellent session. Maybe I'm a little biased because I was the host, but who knows? Um, and I just want to ask the panelists one last thing. It's not so much a question, but if you can just give some advice um, or some words of inspiration for young people who may be interested in, the areas that we've discussed. If you can give any words of inspiration, I mean, we are a youth organization. There are a lot of young people logged in right now. So if you can give some final words of encouragement, some final thoughts, so we can close off. I'll
I'll
invite,
start.
yeah, I'll invite Destiny to start.
Yes, I'm a youth in environmental and energy. Um, and my encouragement to young people that are interested, that aren't certain, is just to be present wherever you are, whatever country you're in, whatever field you are in, even it doesn't matter what mode or direction you believe you're going. Every aspect of our movement has to include our environment. It has to include environmental considerations. It has to be sustainable if it is to make it past or the current changes and the climate direction that we are climate conflict is what I meant, that we are going to be facing, especially as a vulnerable Caribbean community. But truly, there is no reason to be afraid of change, and thus no reason for you to be afraid to be part of change. So thank you so much for being here and being a part of this session. And enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Destiny. Dalton, I'll invite you to chime in now.
Yeah, sure. Just like Destiny said, there's no fear because I think for me the fear of change is not even in the youth; it's with the older heads. So I'm even encouraging the youth to just not be afraid of trying to drive the change, and you're gonna face resistance. And I would also like to say that in the energy sector, though, STEM is very, it's what's more visible. But I think we tend to not see a lot of the administration, the financing, and other areas, even environmental and social and so on, that are just as heavy in terms of the numbers and the importance. So if any, so in other words, if you see energy, you might think you have to be in science, and that's not necessarily the case. I think policy and so on. I think all these areas for energy and the way forward, you can play a part in these areas as well.
Thank you so much. Those are very encouraging final words. And Colin,
Yeah,
last speaker.
just to wrap up, I'll say just stay curious. Do your research, keep reading, and the advice that Destiny and Dalton gave about being fearless and pushing the boundaries must also be grounded in your ability to articulate positions and points. So I think you in whatever you do, make sure that you have that sort of foundation in terms of your research, and your reading and just being curious about different things, and that will take you very far.
Thank you so much. Final words. Thank you to everyone. The panelists, you all were phenomenal, phenomenal. All the members of the chat who were active, CYE and TT team that helped to put this together. Thank you so much. That is the end of our session. And I look forward to seeing you all for future sessions. Don't forget to follow us on social media so you can find out about future events. Thank you. Have a good evening, everyone.